So today we will finish our discussion on the review of labor market theory, and if we have time, we will move on to the next topic. So last week, in the last lecture, we learned about basically labor supply and we are doing labor demand. So labor supply, we found out how the individuals in our model, how the individuals choose between leisure and work, right? And then we saw how non-labor income changes individuals' labor supply, and changes in wage rate changes labor supply. And we also learned about reservation wage. Reservation wage is used to when we think about whether an individual works in the labor market or not, right? Or participate in the labor market or not. And then we moved on to the labor demand side. And the labor first we saw the short-term labor demand. Short-term labor demand is just decreasing, negatively sloped marginal product of labor curve. So since in the short run, the firm tries to optimize their labor input by equating marginal product of labor to wage rate. So marginal product of labor curve is the labor demand curve. And then we started our discussion on labor demand in the long run. So in the long run, the firm can change labor input and capital input. Actually, in theoretical, you can say that in the long run, the firm can change any input to the production. Okay, by definition, that's the long run. And then we learned about isoquant curve and isocost curve, and combining them, we learned about the cost minimization problem of the firm. So if I give you just a short review of the cost minimization, in this case, the firm has a problem of finding the optimal combination of capital and labor, or capital, in this case employment, capital and labor to produce the Q0 output. So Q0 output can be produced using, in this case, like the infinite combinations of capital and labor. In the long run, since we assume that they can change anything, so that, for example, A, P, B all gives the firm the same output, Q0. So the firm's problem is to find the combination that yields the output of Q0 for the lowest cost. Okay, so we introduced the isocost curve here. So isocost curve gives the combination of capital and labor that costs the same amount of money to the company, to the employer, and then this firm tries to minimize it. So the solution is at point P. So this isocost curve. So given the fixed isoquant curve, just find the point that gives the gives the isocost curve the closest to this corner. Okay, so that's point P. At point P, we know that slope of the isocost line is equal to the slope of the isoquant curve at point P. Okay, so that in simple equation, that is MPE over MPK should be equal to W over R. So this is, you can say this is a ratio of the cost, right? Ratio of labor cost to the ratio of capital cost. Okay? And this is a ratio of the gain from each input. You can think of this is the ratio of marginal product of labor to the marginal product of capital. Okay? So ratio of gain should be equal to the ratio of cost. Okay? So you can think of it that way. Okay, there is a little discussion about the intuition part, but it's not that intuitive if you think about it. But anyway, so I'm just skip this. Okay. Now, what we are going to do today is to think about what happens labor demand, since we are interested in firms' labor input or labor demand, we will see how the labor demand changes when they change, when the wage rate changes. Okay? So, for example, let's think that this is a situation before any change. Okay? Now, let's assume, for example, that wage falls. Okay? Let's say, I will draw a diagram here to see, to give you the. So let's say they want to produce Q0, and we know that if ratio of W to R is given by this slope, we know point P is the optimal choice. Okay? So let's say this is employment, this is capital, and so this is, let's say, optimal choice. So what we are asking is, what if the market, labor market changes so that wage become lower? When the wage become lower, first thing that should happen is that the slope of the ISO cost curve must change. Flatter or steeper? It becomes flatter or steeper? It should be flatter because W over R, W becomes small number, so W over R becomes smaller, so that means something like this, right? Okay, so what I'm looking at here is that this, let's say this is C0 over W0, for example, and this is, let's say, C0 over R, right? So this shows the R, let's use R0 in this case. If C0 is the total cost that you are paying before this change, and W0 is the wage rate, R0 is the rental rate of the capital, and then you can see so this way. Now what happens is that W0 becomes smaller, so this should be, let's say, C0 over W1, right? So W0 becomes smaller, so if they use only, for example, labor, they can hire more labor. So C0 over W1 goes outward, okay? Obviously this part shouldn't change because C0 didn't change, R0 didn't change. Get it? So now what happens here is that now the firm should find the new optimum. Okay? So P is not the optimum, obviously. Okay? So what should they do is they should look at the new optimum. So what they do is that they should in a way push the new ISO cost curve inward, right? To find the new optimum. So and then you can easily find that it should be something like this, right? Okay, so let's say this is the new optimum. Got that? And then the cost now they pay is, let's say, C1. Okay? So what we can see, C0, C1, which one is smaller? C1 must be smaller. Okay? So what happens here is that when the wage goes up, two things happen. When the wage goes down, two things happen. They will increase labor input. Okay? Obviously, they will decrease capital input. Okay? Because they are on the same iso-quant curve. When they increase labor input, capital input should necessarily be reduced, right, to produce the same output. And then total cost will be lower. Okay? That. Now, in this case, I just show you the end result, point R. So this we call point R. Okay, get that? Now let's think about it. Actually, let's think about it a little more. Because the thing is, when you think about it, the slope is not only determined by W, but also determined by R, right? So what can happen is that actually not the rent, not the wage falls. Let's say rent goes up, right? If rent goes up, then what happens? W over R, the slope should become, if rent goes up, then the slope will be steeper or flatter. It should become flatter, right? Because think of slope. What's important is not actually what the level of wage, what the level of rent. What's important is the ratio, W over R. Okay? So we talked about wage falls, but also rent goes up, okay? And the slope will become flatter again. Okay? So for example, like wage goes down by 50% or rent goes up by 100%, the slope will be the same. Okay? Half of the previous slope. And what happens? What happens is basically the same thing like this one, because now the slope becomes flatter, right? And then finds a new optimum, and then the optimum will be still R. Get it? So wage goes up, for example, let's say wage goes up by, down. Wage goes down by, let's say, 50%, or rent goes up by 100%. Okay? Basically the same thing. From firm's point of view, in terms of finding the new combination, they will use more labor and less capital. Okay? And the same, actually. The point will be the same. As long as the slope is the same, the optimal point should be the same. Whether wage goes down, or rent goes up. Or you can say even that they change at the same time. Okay? Wage changes and rent changes. What matters at the end is the ratio of wage to labor, wage to rent. Okay? So ratio of wage to rent goes down. So we can say if labor becomes relatively cheaper, the firm will hire more labor, less capital. And if the labor becomes relatively expensive, then they will hire less capital, less labor, more capital. Okay? What matters is the ratio, relative cost. The thing is, but there is one difference. One difference is basically the same thing. And in the previous diagram, I draw a case where that wage falls. Let's say rent goes up. Then what happens? When the rent goes up, then the slope will be flatter. And if they, let's say, use the same C0, it's going to look like this, right? Because wage is still the same, but rent is, let's say, R1. Okay? Like that? So what happens here is that P is not optimum because given the total cost of C0, the firm will never get to point P. Right? If they spend only C0, they cannot produce Q0. So what should happen? What should happen is that before we push down the isocost line, now we have to push up the isocost line. Okay? So it's going to look like this. Okay? So this should be R, let's say. If the slope is the same as before, then the point is going to basically the same, P and R. However, if you look at the total cost, okay, will be higher, right? So when the wage falls, okay, they will hire more labor with lower total cost. When the rent goes up, they will hire more labor with higher cost. Okay? Okay? So that's the difference. Combination of capital and labor will be the same, but total cost will be different. Okay. So given the output Q0, if labor becomes cheaper relative to capital than before, okay, so it includes the case where that wage falls or rent goes up or both happens, but relatively labor becomes more cheaper. And firms will substitute labor for capital. Basically, what happens is substitution. They just substitute labor for capital. They use more labor and less capital. Okay, the assumption obviously should be the labor and capital can be substituted. Okay, in some cases it cannot be substituted. If it's not substituted, then actually no change will happen. Okay, so like you know the complements case. If you have learned like a production theory, there is a complements case. So in some cases, the capital and labor should be used as a fixed ratio to produce 1 unit of output. Okay, then there can be no substitution, right? For example, let's say if you run a transportation business, okay, what you need is a car, but also you need a driver, right? So one car, one driver. So in that case, if the driver wage goes down, okay, then you cannot substitute, okay, driver for car, right? Okay, that obviously cannot happen because they cannot be substituted. Okay, so we assume there is a substitution. Okay, so if you draw a labor demand curve, in that case, in this particular case, if you do that, let's say you change the wage rate, everything else equal, you change the wage rate, then you will see the diagram that's going to look like this. Okay? So when the wage is high, then labor demand will be smaller, and the wage goes down, labor demand will be more. Okay? Obviously, if you try all different wage rate. So this is a labor demand curve, but this is conditional on Q0. Okay? So we are assuming that output is fixed at Q0, and we change only the wage rate, then you will get this labor demand curve. And we call this labor demand curve conditional labor demand curve, meaning that this is a labor demand curve with the condition that the output is equal to Q0. Okay? So if Q0 changes, then labor demand curve will shift. Okay? For example, like if Q goes up, let's say if they want to produce more, the labor demand curve should shift upward, obviously, because upward. Because for the same wage rate, they will use more labor if they want to produce more. And then if the Q0 goes down, just shift downward. Okay. So this is, we call it the conditional labor demand curve. And conditional labor demand curve is negatively sloped with respect to wage and positively sloped. Actually, you can draw a labor demand curve with respect to R, not only wage. But we are more concerned with wage and employment, so we will use only this one. But if you think if it's rent, then this is not negatively sloped. It should be positively sloped. If rent goes up, then they will substitute more and more labor for capital. Okay. And this sentence is the one that I showed you, that if either wage or rent goes down, the total cost of production decreases. Okay? Keeping the production level constant. And if either wage or rent goes up, then total cost will go up. Okay? So even if the combination looks the same, but behind the total cost will be different. Questions? Okay. So what we have established here is that short-term labor demand curve is negatively sloped because it's MPL curve. And the long-run labor, in the conditional labor demand curve in the long run is also negatively sloped. Okay, but with different logic. Okay, what you're concerned here is the relative wage to rent. Obviously, there is MPE and MPK, but also in here we look at MPK as well. So this is the cost minimization part. Now, let's move on to actual real problem, profit maximization. So the firm's objective, right? Ultimate objective is to maximize profit. Okay. So how the firm will maximize the profit? Actually, if you study this problem, for example, mathematically, then actually you can find this is the condition. Okay, now look at the first condition. This is BMP, value of marginal product of labor, should be equal to the wage. Okay, so this is a short-term labor demand curve side. Value of marginal product of labor should be equal to the wage. So what you get using employment, using labor, should be equal to what you pay for labor. And in the long run, not only they can change labor, but also they can change the capital. So the same rule should be applied to capital as well. VMPK. So what you get by spending your money on capital should be equal to what you pay for your capital. That's R. Okay? So you can extend VMPE equal W to the capital, and then you can get the second equation, second condition that should be satisfied, VMPK equals R. What is important here is that these two conditions should be satisfied at the same time. Not only this one, but also that one as well. Okay? So in the short run, they solve only one equation, for example. In the long run, they will solve two equations, two simultaneous equations. Actually, two simultaneous partial equations. Okay, so they will, if they have more inputs, then the same logic applies. If you have the third input, basically the same thing. Value of marginal product of the third input should be equal to the cost of the third input. Because same thing, you can write down all these things into VMP something equals the cost of that thing. And then you can have multiple equations. Since we assumed only two inputs, we can write it down there. But in some cases, there can be more than two inputs. But anyway, it's still the same. You have basically simultaneous equations of more things. Okay. So this is the long-run profit maximization condition. So if the firm finds the combination of capital and labor that satisfies these two conditions at the same time, that would be profit maximizing level of capital and labor. Now let's look at this equation. This equation is right? Okay. And if this is satisfied, then obviously this will be satisfied. Okay? So if these two equations are satisfied, and this one equation should be satisfied, MP, the ratio of MP to MPK should be equal to ratio of W and R. Okay? So what you see here is that this is profit maximization condition. This is cost minimization condition. Okay? So what it says is the profit, if you maximize profit, then you will automatically minimize the cost. The reverse, true or false? In general, it should be false, right? MPE over MPK equals W over R does not imply MPE, for if we ignore P, MPE equals W and MPE equals K, R. Okay, MPK equals R. So only one way. Okay. So that's what we write down here. Profit maximization does imply cost minimization. So cost minimization is only one part of the profit maximization. Okay. There is a second part. Actually, you can think of second part as this way. Actually, the second part is to find the right amount of production. Okay? Given any level of quantity of production, you can find the cost minimizing combination using MP over MPK equals W over R. But the actual real question here is, the equally important question is, what amount you want to produce to maximize profit, right? If you produce too much or too little, your profit will suffer. Okay? So the firm may produce a wrong quantity even though the firm produces that quantity at the lowest cost. Okay? So profit maximization you can think of as two-step process. First, you find the profit maximizing output, and then you minimize the cost. Actually, it's not exactly two-step because they will solve these two problems at the same time. But conceptually, you can think of it as a two-step process. Find the optimal quantity and then find the optimal labor and capital input to produce that quantity. Okay? So cost minimization is only the second step. First step, if you have to complete the first step to actually maximize profit. Okay, so that's the thing. Now, what we are going to do is, at first, today what we have seen so far is the conditional labor demand curve. So we didn't think of change in the quantity of output. Now, when you think of maximizing profit, you should think of quantity as well, not only the combination of labor and capital input. Okay? So now, to really look at the long-run labor demand, what we should look at is, for example, when the wage changes. Okay? So what we are more concerned is when wage changes, what happens to labor input. When the wage changes, then what we should look at is that not only how they minimize cost, first, let's look at how they change the output, optimal output. Now, to think of optimal output, the simple rule we can use is marginal cost should be equal to the marginal revenue. Okay? So think of the profit maximization problem, for example. So this is a total revenue, okay, minus total cost. That's the profit. Okay. Okay. You say, and then total cost will include, for example, W times E plus R times K. Okay. So labor cost plus capital cost gonna be total cost. And total revenue is P times FQ, not FQ, sorry, not FQ. F, E, and K. Okay. So P times Q. So what I was going to write is P times Q. That's total revenue part. And then we can define marginal revenue and marginal cost. So what is the marginal revenue? Marginal revenue is when we change output by 1 unit, by how much total revenue changes. That's marginal revenue. Okay? And the marginal cost is when you change output by 1 unit, then by how much the total cost changes. Okay? So what is the profit maximizing level of output? That should be marginal revenue should be equal to the marginal cost. So this is the when the firm increases, let's say increase the output by 1 unit, they find that their revenue goes up by, let's say, $10, and they find out if they produce 1 more unit, they have to spend, let's say, $5 only. Then what they think is that by producing 1 more unit, they will gain $10, but spend only $5. So they should produce more. And then up to the point where these two are the same. Marginal revenue, marginal cost. So this is actually rule to find optimal quantity, Q star. If you have learned microeconomics and if you remember it, this rule actually implies that VMP equals W and VMPK equals R. Basically, that condition and this condition are basically the same thing, just from looking at different directions, but it gives you the same answer anyway at the end. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look at your microeconomics textbook. Okay? So, what we are thinking is that when you think of quantity, we think of this one. Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And then we decide on quantity, or actually, we will see how the quantity will change, and then we look at MP over MPK equals W over R to find the cost minimization, right? It's a two-step process, as I said. Now, first thing, let's think about, let's say wage goes down. What happens? Obviously, marginal revenue will not change. In the competitive market, it's only the price. Marginal revenue is just the price. But marginal cost will be lower if the wage falls. Everything else equal. Labor becomes cheaper. So to produce 1 more unit, actually, the firm will pay less. Okay? So what happens? Marginal cost curve will shift downward. Marginal cost becomes smaller. And then if we use MR equals MC rule, then optimal output will change from 100 to 150. Okay? So it's a simple thinking, if you think about it. If labor becomes cheaper, then marginal cost of production will be smaller. Since marginal cost of production is smaller, the firm wanna produce more, right? Because marginal revenue should be equal to marginal cost. So it's a simple. The labor cheaper, they will want to produce more. So what happens? What happens here is that before the wage rate changes, they produce 100 units, okay? And then let's say they produce at P. Okay? Now, since labor is cheaper, they want to produce 150. So that means they will produce at higher isoquant curve. Okay? Get that? Right. And what happens? The slope. Look at the slope. The slope of isocost line will be flatter, right? Because wage is lower. So so you can see that this thick line is flatter than the thin line, right? So it becomes flatter. Okay? So you see the two things happen at the same time, right? They produce more and they produce at isocost line flatter than before. Okay, two things happen at the same time. Okay, so this is the result when we consider profit maximization. Okay, so if we consider only cost minimization, we will do it only on this isoquant, but now we move on to another isoquant and then flatter isocost line. Now, so you can see here is that two things happen at the same time. One is that they produce more, and second is that they will change the combination from capital to labor. So actually you can show it using, this is what I said. Wage falls and labor is cheaper, so substitute labor for capital. So even if they don't change the output, this will happen. Okay. And then second thing is that marginal costs are lower, so they produce more. So even if capital and labor cost doesn't change, simply because they produce more, they should use more labor. So that also the increased labor input. So there are each has name. So this part we call it the substitution effect. So substitution effect looks at only the effect of change in the relative cost to substitution part. So this is like cost minimization case. And second part is just look at how the production level changes. Okay, not the relative cost of capital and labor. So we call it the scale effect. So you can think of scale as a scale of production. Okay? So that we have two names, substitution effect and scale effect. Okay. So in the work leisure choice model, we had substitution effect and income effect. In the long run labor demand, we have substitution effect and scale effect. Okay? And as we have done for work leisure choice model, as we have done at the work leisure choice model, we can actually use a diagram to show these two effects. Okay, so what happens here is, let's say this is before anything changes. And let's say wage becomes lower, so they want to produce more to Q1. And it's going to look like point C, right? So this is what you have done and the result. And you can show scale effect and substitution effect. First assume that they produce more, okay, hypothetically, under the same ratio, under the same wage and rent. So in this case, they produce Q1 for the same ratio. So we have a hypothetical isocost line that is parallel to the old one, okay, but producing Q1. So that's going to be point B, if that happened. So A to B is what effect? Should it be? Scale effect. And B to C is substitution effect. And then as you see, the scale and substitution effect the same direction. By scale effect, they produce more. By substitution effect, they produce even more. Okay. Total cost of production. Gonna change from C0 to C1, for example. Okay. We are not sure whether C1 is lower or greater or smaller than C0. It can be smaller, but it can be even greater. Why? Because they produce more, so their revenue is higher. So even if they spend more cost, their profit, okay, can be still maximized. So total cost change is difficult to tell. So what you have seen here is that what it shows us at the end is that when the wage goes down, they will use more labor due to both scale effect and substitution effect. If the wage goes up, then reverse happens, right? Wage goes up, the marginal cost of production goes up, so they want to produce less. So by scale effect, the labor input gonna be smaller because they produce less. And then since wage is higher, so the relatively labor becomes more expensive. So they substitute capital for labor. Okay? So by that substitution effect, they will use less labor. Okay? So what happens is the wage goes up, then long run labor demand will be smaller. Wage goes down, long run labor demand will be higher. Okay? So labor demand curve at the end is negatively sloped. Right? The short run is negatively sloped. Conditional labor demand negatively sloped. And long run labor demand, so we don't have condition anymore. Long run labor demand is also negatively sloped. Okay. If we compare the short run and long run, which one is more elastic? Elastic meaning that when the wage changes, which one will respond more, respond in a way that they hire less labor. So wage goes up, then in the short run they will hire less labor. In the long run as well, they will hire less labor. Okay? But the response, the size of response will be different. Okay? That reduction is bigger in the short run or long run. We have an answer here, right? Wage goes up, right? Then in the short run and long run, the employment will be smaller. Okay? But reduction will be bigger in the long run or short run. In this diagram. Should be long run. Why? Why? In a way, it's simple. Because in the long run, in the short run, they cannot change capital input. They will change only the labor input. Okay? But in the long run, they can change capital input as well. So that means that they have actually more means to adjust in terms of production. Okay? So in the long run, what they can do is that they just substitute capital for labor. They just use more capital and then use less labor. They cannot do that in the short run because by definition they cannot change capital in the short run. So in the long run they can change the capital input as well in a way to substitute the labor. So in the long run actually the impact will be greater. Okay? So when the wage level changes in the short run you may not see much difference. But in the long run you may see a bigger difference. Simply because in the long run, the firm can actually have more means to deal with the wage rate increase or wage rate decrease. Okay? Okay, so that's what it says. Long run labor demand is more elastic than short run labor demand. Oh, one thing that we have to, so far we have to think of, we thought about when the wage changes, how the employment or labor demand changes. But actually, in the long run, what can happen is that when the capital cost changes, then labor input can change as well. Okay, how? Let's say rent on capital falls, so capital becomes cheaper. So capital becomes relatively cheaper, so they substitute capital for labor. Okay? So they can do it. They can do it in the long run. So they will buy more machines. Okay? And let's say they laying off some people. What happens? Demand for labor decreases, obviously. So this is the substitution effect. The rent on capital falls, so marginal cost decreases. Okay, marginal cost of production decreases. So their desired output will increase. To produce more, they will use more capital, but also they have to use more labor. Okay, if we think of only this output part, we call this scale effect. So what you see here is that by substitution effect, demand for labor falls. By scale effect, demand for labor increases. So in this case, scale and substitution effect works two different ways. Okay. So when the wage changes, then scale and substitution effect works to the same direction. When the rent changes, or when the other input's price changes, then scale and substitution effect works to the opposite directions. You can show it using a diagram. So let's say, what is this? Rent falls. Okay, rent goes down, so that means that this isocost line will become steeper, right? Rent goes down, it will become steeper. But since the rent is cheaper, the firm will produce more. For example, the Q1 and steeper curve. So A to C. Okay? Then you can show scale and substitution effect. Scale effect is obviously that you assume that there is a same slope, hypothetically, but on the new isoquant Q1. So that's point B. Okay? And then, so this is the scale effect part. So by scale effect, they will use more labor. Okay? So meaning that if there were no change in the relative price of capital and labor, they produce simply more, then they should use more labor because they produce more. They produce more. So that's the scale effect part, and B to C is the substitution effect part. Okay. Now they substitute capital for labor. So in this case, substitution effect dominates the scale effect. So the more capital will be used and less labor will be used. Okay. Obviously, you can have the opposite case. Some cases, scale effect dominates the substitution effect. If that's the case, then even if labor becomes relatively expensive, the firm will use more labor. Okay, so if we summarize it, you can summarize using the heading the factor price effect. So production factor price effect. Own factor price effect, meaning that what happens to the demand for a particular production factor when its own price changes. So own factor price effect is, for example, that what happens to labor demand when wage changes? What happens to capital demand when rent changes? That's own factor price effect. It's always negative. Okay? Meaning that own factor price goes up, own factor demand goes down. Okay? Wage goes up, labor demand falls. Wage goes down, labor demand goes up. So simple. Now cross factor price effect is the cross effect. So for example, when the wage changes, what happens to demand for capital? When the rent changes, what happens to demand for labor? That's cross factor price effect. And it can be negative or positive. Okay? Depending on which effect dominates, scale and substitution effect. It's negative if scale effect dominates the substitution effect, meaning that rent goes up, then labor for demand may fall. Okay? If scale effect dominates substitution effect. Positive, if rent goes up, I should use rent goes down because I showed it. So rent goes down, then if scale effect dominates substitution effect, then labor demand will go Okay? And if sufficient effect dominates the scale effect, if rent goes down, okay, then labor demand will fall. Okay? The size of sufficient effect depends on the degree of substitutability between the factors. So if they are more easy to substitute, then sufficient effect is bigger. If it's more difficult to substitute, then sufficient effect will be smaller. Okay. Why are we concerned about this? The thing is this. The government policy often changes the factor price. For example, we think of, for example, later we will talk about, for example, like social insurance, let's say. Let's say social insurance, usually social insurance for the employees. So they say you get a job, okay, for a firm. Then you will get salary, but the salary it will not be the full salary. No? When you get the salary, then you will see some items that are not included to your, in your pocket salary. For example, that may include for your tax, right? So usually the firms will deduct your income tax beforehand. Also, it includes the contribution to, let's say, health insurance, okay, to your national pension. Okay, we will talk about it later. Also, to your employment insurance. Even if you don't know what they mean, it doesn't matter. We will learn it about it later in this semester. But what happens is that the social insurance, okay, you have to pay for that insurance coverage. But not only you, but also your employer will pay. For example, like employment insurance, okay, then your total pay, 4.5% of your total pay will be deducted for your part. But also 4.5, the same amount will be paid by your employer, even though you don't see it in your salary slip. So, for example, now if let's say the government changes, let's say that rate. Let's say they change it, okay, now the company not pay 4.5%, they should pay, let's say, 6% of the employee salary as insurance, for insurance coverage. So what happens? What happens is that from employer's point of view, labor became more expensive, right? Because when they hire one more person, now they have to think of how much I should pay for this person's insurance. Okay? It's a mandatory insurance. It's a crime not to pay it. So they have to pay it, and then the cost of labor just increased. Then what happens to labor demand? So you can actually using this, logic to think about what would be effect of that change in, let's say, social insurance system on labor market, for example. Okay, obviously, what it shows here is that if labor becomes more expensive, then labor demand will fall. Okay? And demand for capital likely to increase or decrease depending on scale and substitution effect. Okay? So that's why we talk about this labor demand part, especially in the long run. Okay, so that's the one that we covered for labor demand. So what we have learned so far is actually, you can say the labor demand curve is negatively sloped at the end, right? For various reasons. You should know the reasons. If you're a student of economics, you should know the reasons why it's negatively sloped. Okay, if you're not economics major, you don't have to know it, but if you're an economics major, you should know why it's negatively sloped. Okay. Now, so we have covered supply and demand pretty quickly, and let's look at the labor market equilibrium at the end. So at the labor market equilibrium, what you are concerned is what would be the employment level in this labor market and what would be the wage level in this market. Okay. So in the labor supply curve, what you have seen is that for each wage level, how much labor will be supplied. And then for labor demand, what you have seen is that for each wage rate, how much labor will be demanded by the firm. Okay? And actually, it doesn't tell you what happens actually in the market. In the market, when the supply and demand meets, Okay, and for after some reasoning, we are not going to cover, we will reach a market equilibrium. Okay, if the market is functioning perfectly. So that's W star and E star. W star is the market wage and E star is the employment level. Oh, I'm not gonna spend the detail about this. So what happens here is this. Also, and then we have surpluses, like produce surplus, worker surplus. It's like a consumer surplus, the produce surplus thing. So what it means is that if it's market wage W star and these people get surplus because they get more than what they're willing to work for. Okay? And these firms get surplus because they are paying less than what they are willing to pay for. Okay? So surpluses. Okay. I'm going to actually go over very quickly about this labor market equilibrium. Okay, what happens is that in the cases where the markets are perfect and there is no cost of movement across different labor markets, let's say across different regional labor markets, for example, what happens at the end is that it should be equalized. The wage should be equalized. Why? For example, let's say there are two areas, let's say Seoul and Busan. Okay? In Seoul, at Seoul, market wage is W1. At Busan, let's say market wage is W2. Okay? Let's say there is no restriction on movement across between these two areas. And then let's say there is no cost of moving from one to another. Okay? Then what happens? If you're a worker, obviously that you want to move to a place where you are paid more. So at Busan, people will just move out. In Seoul, people will move in. So labor supply will shift to the right and labor supply will shift to the left. At the end, they are going to be the same. Okay? So as long as there is a free movement, okay, and the markets are perfectly competitive, what we see is that the leveling of wage, equalization of wages across labor markets. So in this case, it doesn't matter whether you work in Seoul or in Busan. Okay. In reality, it's not true, right? Because there is a cost of moving. Okay. Now, this part is a bit different, but same logic. Let's assume that the employees cannot change their location, but only the employer can change their location. And then basically the same thing will happen. Let's say Seoul, WA, and Busan is WB. Okay? Employer can change. The firms can change their location. What happens? Now, if you're a firm, if you're an employer, obviously you want to move to a place where labor is cheaper. Okay? So in Seoul, labor firms will move out. So labor demand will shift to the left. And in Busan, more firms want to hire, so labor demand will shift to the right. At the end, wage should be equal. So as long as there is a wage change, wage difference, okay, either workers will move or firms will move, and at the end, they should be equal. Okay? But as I said, in reality, that's not necessarily true, okay, because there is cost of moving. Actually, in real world, you see this tendency of wage equalization. For example, like if you think of, let's say, Chinese wage, right? The Chinese wage is much higher than, let's say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Okay? It's because because Chinese wage is so low, lots of firms go there and set up their factory. Okay? And then that shifts up the labor demand. So we can think of this is actually Chinese labor market. So more firms want to hire people. So their wage will go up. Okay? And then firms will move out of country, let's say Korea or some other countries. Labor demand will fall. So there will be more equalization. Okay? So now the Chinese wage is much closer to, let's say, global wage level than, let's say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And so there's a news report saying that now the firms want to set up their factories in even cheaper places, like going to somewhere else. Okay? So, that's what exactly happened. Well, obviously, the Chinese wage is not exactly equal to the global wage, but because there are cost of moving and all the other rules and institutional differences. Well, you can clearly see that there is a tendency to such equalization. So this is one implication of perfectly competitive labor market. Here we are just talking about perfectly competitive labor market. And then what we see here is that perfectly competitive labor market, and there is a movement, as I said, for equalization of wages. And from whole economy's perspective, or from global perspective, then moving is actually beneficial. Okay. So here we use like north and south. This is a high wage area. This is lower wage area. And let's say think of labor supply. Make things simple. Let's say labor supply curve is vertical, okay, perfectly inelastic. And then since the southern wage is low, people will move out. So labor supply curve will move from this to the left. And here, move to the right. Okay? So at the end, the wage will be same, W star. So in north, it changes from A to B. In south, no label. But anyway, from here to there. Okay? So what happens here is that this is the gain of production. This blue one, blue trapezoid, is the gain of production in north, and this smaller one is the loss of production in south. And obviously, which one is bigger? Gains bigger than the loss. So at the end, the global economy, let's say, gains, because before, compared to the time where there was no movement, now we have more production as a whole. Why? Actually, the reason is simple. The wage is higher actually means that their productivity is higher. Wage is higher. Okay. Why the wage is higher in north? Because their productivity is higher. Okay. It's possibly because there is shortage of labor there. Okay. South, wage is lower because their productivity is lower. Why is their productivity is lower? Probably there is a surplus of people there. Okay. So people are used in less productive way because there are so many people, and there's so few people. People are used in more productive way because there are so few people. So moving from south to north means moving from less productive region to more productive region. So people move to the places where they can produce more. Okay? So that's the essence of the movement from lower productive area to the more productive area. That basically shows up as wage difference. So since the same people works in more productive area, total production will be higher. Okay? So the allocation of labor in this sense is efficient. Because before the allocation, it's actually they're wasting the labor resource. They're wasting the people. People here are just used in less productive way. If they move to there, so as a whole, the society will benefit because they will be used more productively. So that's the thing that I just said. Competitive equilibrium allocation of labor is efficient because there's overall gains from trade increase. Okay, so what you have seen is first we learned about work leader choice model and then we derived labor supply curve. And along the way we learned the important concept of income effect, substitution effect, and reservation wage. Okay? And in the labor demand curve, in the labor demand part we learned about, at the end we derived the labor demand curve. And important concepts are short-term labor demand curve, conditional labor demand curve, and long-run labor demand curve, and scale and substitution effect. Okay, it tells you how the labor demand will change in response to change in the wage rate or change in the price of other inputs. Okay, we combine them, then we can actually see that there is a market equilibrium, and the market equilibrium will tell us for how much wage, for what level of wage, how many individuals or how much labor input is used in that particular labor market. And then we have seen the efficiency of perfectly functioning labor market. Okay, so we finish our discussion of labor market theory today, okay? But as I told you before that this review is very brief, okay? In my labor economics course, I usually spend half a semester in covering these supply, demand, and equalization. So in no way it covers the whole thing. It actually covers only small part of the total of the theory that I usually teach. Okay, so, but these are the basis. And knowing this basis from next lecture, tomorrow, we will begin our discussion on first, social welfare. Okay? And then we move on to next topics. Okay, that's it for today.